Good afternoon. I'm Robert Galford, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our Compensation Committee webinar series, titled The Age of Alignment, Part 3, Moving from Theory to Practice. This series is designed to explore a fundamental question that was raised by the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission on Strategy Development. And that question is, does your company's incentive structure reinforce or does it unintentionally undermine its chosen strategy? Parts 1 and Part 2 of this series, which are available for replay, outlined a number of diagnostic tools and approaches that boards can use to uncover potential misalignment between their strategy and the design of their compensation program. We've also looked at various protocols that can help improve alignment and drive toward desired goals. Yet as we know, and as we've seen most recently, protocols cannot anticipate every situation. And in fact, the fresh news on proposed SEC rules regarding pay-for-performance disclosure is a perfect example, and we're going to turn to that very quickly. I'm joined today by Jim Heim and Theo Sharp, both managing directors in the Boston office of Perlmutter & Partners, and by their partner, Deb Livshay, who is in the New York office as a managing director, where she heads the firm's technical services practice. And today we're going to talk about some of these real-world examples that show how companies have put these smart theories and protocols into practice and how they've remained disciplined towards strategy execution, but at the same time knowing how to stay flexible in order to accommodate the unexpected. Before we begin, let me turn it over to Ronell Perry with NACD's education team for a few housekeeping announcements. Ronell?
Rob, can you continue? I'm having a few difficulties. Please continue with the presentation.
Sure. Let me just step in there for a moment briefly to explain one of the first things I want to make sure of, which is to make this as interactive as possible. We're going to ask you to submit questions and comments at any time, and we are going to do our best to answer them throughout as time permits. And at a minimum, we'll make sure that we leave ample time at the end to cover these points. There are going to be several live polls through the sessions. We're going to ask you some questions. They will appear in your slide window when announced. And we're going to ask you to click on the buttons below the slide area to access some additional resources. So we're going to ask you also to take a moment to download the presentation now. And you'll find that as well at perlmutter.com/PFPUKUS. That's perlmutter.com/P as in Peter, F as in Frank, P as in Peter, UKUS. I should also mention that you're going to add on.
Rob, I'm sorry. I'm back live. Audience, just to let you know, we have a new console, and if at any moment during the presentation you have a question, please submit the question. We are also live tweeting. You can follow the tweets, and you can participate live within the console. And as Rob said, you can also download the presentation and access additional resources. Also, you will receive one NACD skill-specific credit for your participation. Your credit can be applied to your NACD fellowship program. You can contact the information on the screen. And once again, visit perlmutter.com early next week and nacdonline.org early next week for a copy of the presentation. Rob, I'm sorry about that. Back to you.
Not at all. I'm glad we have you back. As we said earlier, I want to make sure we do outline what is on board for us in today's discussion, and we are going to start with what is the latest and greatest with regard to the SEC's proposed pay-for-performance rules in a nutshell. And this is literally just this week, and so we're going to be doing that first with Deb in a moment. The rest of our time we're going to be doing just what I hope one might expect, which is a quick review of Parts 1 and 2 in the Age of Alignment series. We want to talk a little bit about how one sets the framework for incentive design analyses. We want to make sure we cover the best ways to integrate both market and industry practices, along with optics and performance alignment, and the realities of both business and industries in which you folks both operate and compete. We want to make sure when reality comes in here, we can talk a little about what we do when the numbers really don't tell the whole story, which of course happens with great frequency. And how one therefore weights both the subjective, the strategic goals, against the objective and financial goals that might be established as well. And perhaps the best way to make sure we bring that home is to give you some case study examples of that, and Jim and Theo will do that as well. So let me now turn it over back to Deb, who really is the expert in this brand new breaking area of activity. Deb?
Thanks, Rob. It's kind of funny because I was brought in late to this process as the SEC rules came out suddenly in the middle of all of this. And I know the title of this is Theory to Practice, where Theo and Jim will be talking about all sorts of strategy and what's important to your company and in terms of developing compensation systems. But really, my part, it almost seems, is going backwards from practice to theory, because now what we're trying to do is take a backward-looking approach required by the SEC to show disclosure about some relationship that they've picked between your pay and your performance. So with that said, let me just give you a little bit of a background. This all came out of the Dodd-Frank Act, which was, it became law over 5 years ago now. And in Section 953 of the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress told the SEC to give us rules that would require companies to disclose, and this is wording from the statute, the relationship between executive comp, actually paid, and financial performance. And the company must take into account change in values of shares of stock and dividends of the company and distribution. So in a way, the SEC didn't have a whole lot of leeway in issuing regulations because they were bound by statutory requirements. So what does that mean? How did they come out, and what did they propose? The way they came out was that what is required in the disclosure is both pay and performance information for the past 5 years for large accelerated filers. And so obviously that's 2 more years of data than what is normally in our standard compensation tables. So for example, if this rule became final for the 2016 proxy statement, we'd be showing data for years 2011 through 2015. There was a phase-in so that in the first year you'd only be showing 3 years, the second year 4 years, and by the third year we'd be into full disclosure for the full 5 years of data. Who's included? Most of us thought that it would be limited to CEO. That's an approach we've been taking in the pay for performance disclosures. Up until now, it's an approach that ISS and Glass Lewis has taken. It's really limited a comparison of TSR to CEO data. However, the SEC saw it fit to include all NEOs, and there's really a lot of data because now it's all NEOs for 5 years, and you will take an average of that NEO data. For the CEO, you will have all CEOs for the past 5 years, and if there are multiple CEOs in 1 year, you will aggregate the data, and I'm sure a lot of you could see all sorts of ways that could go haywire with incoming and outgoing packages. For the compensation, the compensation that will be used, instead of taking the total compensation number used from the summary compensation table, it will be tweaked because the SEC did not think at this point that that reflects the actual compensation as intended by the Dodd-Frank Act. So what they did is they took equity values, which have been since 2006 reported as the grant date fair value, and instead of using that value, you will look at the past year, you will see what has vested in that past year, and you will take the vesting value. For stock awards, that's not so hard because we already have a supplemental table, the stock option exercise and stock vested table. You'll take it from there. For stock options, it gets a little bit more complicated because we'll have to do a revalue with new assumptions as to the vesting, not exercise, but whatever has vested in the past year. Another tweak to the total.
To be clear, this isn't a realized or realizable necessarily because you're almost Black-Scholes-ing the whatever's outstanding but became vested, right?
Black-Scholes-ing. Yeah, that's a verb. Okay, yeah, you are. And in fact, a lot of people, we won't get into all the nuances of all the problems of all these rules, but a lot of people have a problem with this actual compensation number because it's neither realized nor realizable pay, which are 2 other ways that companies have been showing their pay for performance disclosure. So it is just that. You'll have to take another Black-Scholes of the option if it's vested in the past year. Another tweak besides equity values is to the pension cost. In the past, in the summary compensation table, the regulation states that you have to report any actuarial increase in the pension, which in the past year, which causes all sorts of problems when interest rates fluctuate and when, depending on an executive's age and date till retirement, it could be all over the place. But the SEC realizes that what's the real number that we're looking for each year at issue is the increase due to the service cost for the year. So that number will be a little bit different, and most companies will be working with their finance people and their actuaries to get that number. So that one half of the equation is how will compensation be defined for purposes of disclosure. The other half is how will performance be defined, and I'm sure it will come to no surprise to most of you that the SEC went with TSR because it's probably the easiest and the most comparable across companies. So what you'll need to do is disclose your TSR for the past 5 years. But the SEC went one step further and said not only do you have to disclose your TSR, but you have to disclose a peer group TSR, which could either be your selected peer group in your proxy, or it could be the peer group that shows on a performance graph in your annual report, which is an index or a composite or a published industry index. So, now we have all these pieces of data that have been tweaked from the summary compensation table. Plus you have TSR, plus you have your peer group TSR, and you'll have to weight the peer group TSR will have to have a weighted average. So lots of new work to comply with this new rule and gather a lot more data. Fortunately, there are certain exemptions if you are an emerging growth company, so you just went public under the Jobs Act, or you're a former private issuer or certain investment companies, you don't have to provide this disclosure. If you're a smaller reporting company and you have a public float as of the end of the second quarter that's under 75 million, you'll be subject to scale disclosure, so you'll only have 3 years of reporting. You'll only be reporting 3 NEOs, which is typical in your regular CDNA. And you won't have any pension inclusion in the disclosure, and you won't be subject to the peer TSR disclosure. So you get a little bit of a break if you're a smaller reporting company. And the last thing that's sort of new here is the interactive dating tagging. All of these little bits and pieces will now need to be tagged separately in XBRL so investors can pull data easily and compare it and use it, and the SEC assumes that this will make investor decisions a little bit easier. So if we can move on to the next slide, we'll take a look at what the outcome is. So, first we talk about how the SEC interpreted these pieces of the Dodd-Frank Act. Now let's turn to, what does this look like? What's required now? Well, the first part of this is this new pay versus performance table. And that will include, for all of the 5 years that are covered, all of these pieces of data. So for the CEO, it will have the summary compensation total number, the actual number. For the NEOs, it will average their data over each year and provide the same. Then we'll see the company TSR, and we'll see the peer group TSR. So that's populating your table. The harder part of this exercise, of course, is providing the narrative disclosure or the explanation of the required relationships. The SEC has told us they'd like us to describe the relationship between actual compensation paid for the CEO and average NEOs and the company TSR, and in addition, the company TSR versus the peer group TSR. You could explain this however you want. You could provide narratives, you could do it graphically, charts, narratively, however you want. You could even provide supplemental disclosure about how you really see compensation and how you really see performance, which is a lot of what many proxies have been doing over the past few years to show the actual things that committees are considering when they're making compensation decisions. You could provide the supplemental data so long as it doesn't obscure the regular data or the required data and disclosures. So, where we are now is the SEC proposed these rules on April 29th. We have until July 7th to submit comments, and we will be submitting comments. We're encouraging our clients to solicit comments. There's a lot of areas of gray here that could use some clarity, and a lot of areas that are just really objectionable to many of our clients. So there you have it. We don't know when the final rules can come out. They can come out as early and be as applicable as early as 2016, but they could be delayed as there's no delay mandated in Dodd-Frank as to implementation of this disclosure requirement. So with that, I thought it would be fun to go to a polling question, if we could pull that up. So the question we would like to pose to you today is, do you think the SEC's proposed disclosure rules provide greater clarity to investors to better understand pay for performance alignment, or do they further muddy the waters? Please circle using the following scale, 1 being create greater confusion, and 5 being create greater clarity.
So while we're waiting for that, Deb, I know at least one question came through that was, I think, straightforward, just asking, what is an NEO?
Sorry about that. So an NEO is a named executive officer. Those are the people who are reported in your proxy statement. Every year it includes your CEO, your CFO, and generally your next 3 highest paid officers.
We're going to give you all the softballs today, Deb.
I like that one.
So again, now folks are voting on that 1 to 5 scale, which is 1 being clear as mud and 5 being clear as day, right?
All right. So let's see.
Well, this is interesting. We get, people are in. I think, on one hand, a lot of people are saying, well, this is the only way you can get comparable data, and it's good that the SEC gave us some guidance instead of leaving it completely flexible and having companies just describe whatever they think is their pay and their performance. And some companies thinking, okay, this is probably the best you could do with the DFA mandate.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised, actually. I would have expected a higher 2 there, just because of the lack of very specifics in the regs.
Oh, got it. Let's drive forward and move on to the next slide right now.
Good. In fact, let's turn this over to you folks here in Boston and get Jim and Theo to. Now, Deb, you are going to be with us later on because I suspect there's going to be some more questions on this particular area. So if you can hang with us, that'd be great. But in the meantime, let me turn it over to Theo and Jim.
Okay. So I'm going to speak first. This is Jim Heim. So in December, our colleagues Steve Van Putten, Michael Ng, they sketched out for the NACD a number of diagnostic tools that, I guess they could be used to do 2 things, really. First was uncover business strategy, and then moving on to number 2, examine whether the strategic priorities are, in fact, captured in the company's compensation program design. So, for example, you look on the right side of this slide, you're going to see a graphical representation that we use with clients when we're trying to better understand the key drivers of enterprise value. And when things go well, this tool, it's great for identifying key performance drivers and what priorities those drivers suggest. So in an ideal world, well, frankly, we then simply make the brilliant observation that those priorities should probably be reflected in incentive plans, and our sage counsel would be appreciated.
Hey. Likely followed and hopefully well compensated, right, Jim?
That would be absolutely perfect from your lips to God's ears. Unfortunately, in the real world, business management, it gets a little messy because businesses are not, in fact, easily reduced to these neat color-coded boxes. So we end up having discussions about how the incentive design shouldn't just be a listing of desirable outcomes like revenue growth or getting a new product to market in an acceptable time frame. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a good start, but incentive design, it should also reflect the company's stated strategy for achieving success in its market. Incentives are a prime opportunity to signal to employees why the company is opting to pursue long-term investment over short-term profit, or vice versa. And if you do this right, you can actually find yourself in this positive feedback loop where, because employees better understand what they're trying to accomplish, they're actually able to accomplish it. And that's the so-called virtuous cycle that's noted in the last sub-bullet on this page. Let's go ahead. Let's move on to the next slide. I think, Theo, you're going to talk about this one.
Yeah, I love those 2 consulting speaks, feedback loop and virtuous cycle.
Yeah,
nice.
People work hard at those. Yeah.
Nicely done, Jim.
Absolutely.
All right, so having gone through in December sort of the strategy exercise, presenting that and identifying sort of the key components of business focus, in March, Matt Turner and Michael Ling went through and helped us look at getting performance measurement right and how that can support strategy. And by the way, I'd like to point one thing out. If you'll notice, one person did both of those, Michael Ling, right? So you know where all the work gets done around here, I think.
Yes.
Right. So really what they were saying is through some rigorous financial analysis, businesses can identify specific sort of financial measures that reflect progress against the strategy that they've analyzed and identified. Then they'll do a little further analysis can be done and identify the drivers behind those larger measures. And if you can do that, and the management team understands how, from an operational basis, they can affect those drivers and the overall measures, everyone's in a good place. And in some cases, as Jim said, and these are typically in more, mature industries where there's not a lot of market disruption, and the sort of financial business models are well understood and tested, and they understand what happens in ups and down cycles and all that, you can sort of stop there. And that'll give you your good answers to incentive designs, and everyone goes away happy, Jim said. Sometimes, though, it's not that simple. You have some examples here, but you have a management team that's sort of more entrepreneurial, say, or you have a new technology that's challenging the current product set, or maybe investors just aren't buying into the business model. Whatever it is, sometimes you need to go through just the simple sort of stuff that goes beyond the complex financial drivers of value creation.
I like that you're calling it simple, because frankly, I look at the stuff that Mike and Matt were talking about in March, and that's as close to rocket science as we get.
It's well beyond my pay grade, that's for sure. So I'll give you
Fair
that.
enough.
The complex financial drivers of value creation that Matt and Michael went through. When I guess the question then is, when do you need to go in a different direction than those measures will tell you to do?
You're going to tell us.
Smart ass. Yeah, he's sitting here. Not really. I'm not going to tell you, because any good consultant won't tell you exactly how to do it. But we will go through our thinking at least, on how committees should use a process to at least evaluate the situation every year and at least be informed when they're making the decisions whether to go away from the strict financial analysis or not. Okay? So from there, if we go to the next slide, Ronell. We'll start here with a statement that should be pretty obvious, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to good media headlines or easy sort of out-of-the-box situations. Basically, strategy sometimes isn't best represented only by financial indicators. Now, I venture to say probably very close to 100% of the experienced board members will agree with that, and that there are just times when the right thing to do in the long term, I guess, or even the short term, won't produce a nice graph, a nice line on a graph that sort of starts at the bottom left and goes up to the right at a steep angle that everybody loves to see. And let's face it, every business goes through sort of these times. Sometimes the cause is external, sometimes it's internal, but it happens regardless. There's some simple examples here, right? So you have a turnaround after a product fails, or industry disruptions from, whether that's a new technology or maybe a lack of consumer acceptance or acceptance of another product. Certainly bankruptcies can produce some short-term decisions that go against the grain, or innovation within the business itself. A new patent that somebody within the company comes up with and says and points that same company in some direction that is off from the industry. In all these cases, though, businesses are sort of forced to adapt either to a new business model or figure out a way to get back to that long-term success they had, all while at the same time surviving sort of in the short term. Now, although most of these are sort of externally focused situations, internal situations can pop up that do this also, and produce those sort of decisions that will sacrifice immediate financial results and get you out of that paradigm of just analyzing the financials of the company and pegging your incentives to it. So internal changes can be generally characterized as either business issues or cultural issues. Now that you can have leadership changes or general corporate culture can result in sort of the rejection of certain types of incentive strategies that may be a result of sort of the strict adherence to financial metrics. And in sort of a related way, M&A can do the same thing. Not only from sort of the disruption of the financials of both of the companies involved, but also merging of cultures can really derail what might have been a perfectly executed sort of metric strategy for incentives. But interestingly, the one I see that gets in the way very often, maybe most often, but in my view should sort of sometimes be ignored, are sort of the outside influencers like ISS, other institutional shareholders, and particularly the media. Those influencers can sort of push a company to take a cookie-cutter approach to incentives when what's really needed is something tailored specific to the situation that company's going through at any time. That sort of covers what's here. In any case, Jim, why don't we go through the thinking of how, our thinking on how committees should be sort of assessing what the best incentive design may be in any given year.
Okay. Jim, give us a structure here. Give us something in the way of like a methodology, a protocol, an approach that we can follow. That may be a helpful way.
That's what we're going to do. Absolutely. Yeah. So what we're going to think about here, it's a flexible protocol that can help optimize incentive design by considering the business strategy. And what I'm going to suggest, it's a 3-stage process where you move from evaluate to balance to adjust. So first up, evaluate. This is a diagnostic exam of the state of the business, the industry, and external forces. The business state, that's constantly in flux. You need to consider not only the strategic imperatives, that company-specific path to value creation, but also financial imperatives like generating enough cash to pay the workforce and to fund investment. Cultural imperatives, those are always in the background, and I know there's a lot of folks who will suggest they should be up front, especially when things are going wrong. There's certain behaviors, there are just certain behaviors you want your incentives to foster and other behaviors that are simply unacceptable. And it's really nice if your incentive plan is in sync with those cultural priorities.
But either way, I think that's an underrated piece of generally what companies do in terms of designing incentives, because unless the culture will embrace the incentive, I don't think it's ever going to work, no matter how well designed it is.
Right. I think there's a saying that the best incentive plans will often bear management's imprint, and frankly, management's imprint has got to be embedded in the culture.
Right.
Industry-specific items, I think those are self-explanatory, but let's spend a moment on external forces. Publicly traded companies in the say-on-pay era, they need to be aware of the perspectives of ISS and in some cases Glass Lewis. Those are the proxy advisors, the guys who have very specific thought on the right way to structure compensation and are going to tell your institutional investors how they think they should vote based on those specific thoughts. And it's quite possible that their protocols are not going to prove effective for your own company's challenges. You still need to be aware of where you deviate, though, from that ISS or Glass Lewis prescribed approach, because the onus is going to be on you to make a convincing case to shareholders that you're right and ISS is wrong. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about the concept of balance. Now, let's just think for a moment about how the weighting that you're going to place on financial measures like EPS growth or return on investment versus the weighting you place on strategic measures like product milestones, market expansion. Well, those are going to vary based on business stage. And younger emerging companies, they're usually not ready to assess performance strictly on financial measures. This is the old adage that you can't really measure people on revenue growth until they actually have revenue. Their priorities, they're usually going to be strategic in nature, and frankly, I think it's okay for the incentive plans to reflect that. The converse is true for mature companies. And if you're in a turnaround state, shifting your technology offering platform in a timely fashion or retaining a single major customer, that's going to be the difference between bankruptcy and a second chance. So it would be silly in that situation to just focus on the standard, hit these EPS and revenue hurdles this quarter approach for your incentive plan in most turnaround situations. Let's keep moving. Let's go on to the next slide.
One sec, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I think these are good examples of how to balance, but I think that in most cases you're going to find in betweens, right? And that's the reason we want to have, or that we suggest at least, the compensation committees go through an exercise like this every year when they're designing the incentives to be sure that something hasn't shifted slightly one way or the other that'll cause them to move up and down this is sort of almost a scale spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, this balance really is a scale. I mean, and what I like about these is they're very quick tests. You're not going to have to spend an extensive amount of time doing it. They're not quite binary, but you've got 4 areas that you can explore and at least get a finger on the pulse pretty clearly.
Yeah, and you can get, I mean, if you sit with management for an hour meeting with the compensation committee, these can get laid out pretty quickly.
Yeah, and what's fantastic it is, it's also reaching consensus. I do think when you're talking about these items in a boardroom session, you get fantastic ROI on the board's time.
Yeah, and look, we're not pushing that you always go off the grid, right, with regard to this. Sometimes this will push you towards the very simple, easy process that we did in the first 2 Age of Alignment webinars.
So we're all in agreement. This is like motherhood and apple pie. It's fantastic stuff.
Yay.
All right, let's go on to moving to adjustments. What I'm going to speak to here is adjustments that are specific to short versus long-term performance horizons. I like to avoid redundancy between short-term and long-term plans, and I generally suggest a heavier emphasis on strategic priorities, or for companies that are outside of that emerging phase, financial measures that emphasize growth or income in the short term. Frankly, revenue growth, operating income, those really seem to dominate internal business reviews for one-year periods. So those are generally good items to have in the annual bonus plan. Over the longer term, though, most investors and management teams are going to feel that you need to make progress on margins and return on investment if you're going to be successful over the long term. So those measures, well, guess what? They work well with performance shares or cash-based long-term incentive plans where you're starting to talk about those 3, 4, 5-year measurements.
So in the simple construct, it's income statement in the short term, balance sheet in the long term.
That is, yes. That is an excellent shorthand. Naturally, there's going to be exceptions to every rule. But I think we should move on to the case studies instead of obsessing over exceptions.
Maybe before we do that, let's get a sense of the meeting a little bit.
Yeah.
There's another polling question here to perhaps, and while I think the case studies will be wonderful and illustrative, we're a bit curious to see if those among you here who've been listening and participating, how are you feeling about this? Are you in reasonably good shape right now at your companies with regard to the alignment of incentives and company strategy? As Jim has just taken us through that evaluate, balance, adjust approach, it would be interesting if we could ask you to say, how are you feeling? Again, this is secret ballot, so your names will not be disclosed or revealed. We have the City of Chicago taking care of all voting irregularities in collaboration with the state of Florida on a historical basis. So if you can at least believe that the NSA is not involved in this, this really is a secret ballot. How are you feeling about this? How well aligned do you believe your current incentive programs are with your company's strategy? And again, 1 to 5 scale, 1 being not at all aligned, wrong priorities to executives, really not the right path, and number 5 saying, you know, we are in pretty good shape, well aligned, balanced with strategic, financial, cultural imperatives. Yeah. So this is where we would not use the copyrighted Jeopardy music, but this is where the voting would then come in. So if you submit an answer, this would be a good time.
We wouldn't object to the music; they had it available, but
right.
So 1 is disaster, and 5 is you're not telling me anything I don't know already.
Right. We'll let that run for just a few more seconds just to get a sense.
And then we'll move on to case study.
Yeah, if you want, we can spend some time talking about deflate gates. We've got all kinds of topics to fill.
Don't get me started.
All right. Okay.
Well, that's actually so. There is hope in the world.
Yeah. This is actually very positive. This is good to see. I think what this suggests also is there's probably 2 avenues that companies are going down. Some of them are doing this in a very formal fashion. Some are doing it in an informal fashion. Right. But they seem to be getting to a place where they feel pretty good. Well, we'd like those, obviously. It'd be fantastic if we could move more and more companies into those numbers 4 and number 5.
Well, I mean, I think that's the point of using a construct every year like this to go through it, to get everybody more comfortable. Move those 3s to 4s and 4s to 5s.
Right. As long as there's the evaluate, balance, adjust really makes it easy. But again, I would indeed take heart as sort of a corporate community to say, hey, we're it could be a whole lot worse at this point.
Yeah.
There you go.
So let's do some of those cases.
All right. I'll start.
Okay. Well, get
all right. And this is, this actually, although this is a real case, frankly, it's come up a few times recently, for me at least. And I know there are a couple industries where this is applying right now. So
yes, this looked very familiar.
Yes, I think most of the consultants, frankly, in our firm, and I know in many other firms, are seeing this as we go.
I've seen this movie before.
Right. Yeah. So, using our construct, let's take a look at the imperatives. Okay. So we've got a mid-cap technology company, and first, strategically, those imperatives is a push to get out of the low-margin hardware into higher-margin software. That's actually been going on for a while. It's sort of migrating into some odd other industries, some related industries. So when that happens, new product development is key, and the customer mix sort of needs to be changed. But in order to do all of this, right, you have to keep the legacy products maintained, and that keeps the brand awareness out there and the financial stability through the change, right? So those are sort of your strategic imperatives. Financially, positive cash flow is key here. The company didn't want to take on too much debt during the strategic change, which means holding margins on the old business was key as those products became more commoditized. Now, culturally, this was tough. The executives needed to shift from hardware to software executives, which is a different type of business, but it's been a long-standing management group, so the turnover really isn't desired by the board at all, or the CEO. And you also have to consider from a cultural standpoint, share prices are probably going to stagnate for a while, making equity incentives which have naturally been the focus of most technology companies, say, and life science companies, and really, the last decade, the majority of companies are focusing on it. But the mind share of those equity incentives really deteriorates, and the incentive deteriorates as that happens. Now, from an industry, looking at the industry imperatives, it's obvious technology is changing, the legacy businesses are stagnating, and again, all this pointing to change. The first age of alignment sessions, of course, would really focus on metric design analysis, don't apply so well to sort of this type of real-world situation that's happening all the time. And particularly given the cultural imperatives that we talked about, and the non-financial balance that's sort of implied in that situation becomes even more important. So I guess we'll turn it over and see what happened. And again, I know of at least 2 industries where this is going on and boards are struggling with this as we speak. So while this is a single example, I think there are lots of conversations about this.
So next slide.
Next slide, Renaud. So you probably, frankly, could have guessed what happened. After going through the evaluation of those imperatives, we went about balancing the focus of the incentives, or frankly, rebalancing the focus of the incentives. And then we went and looked at the time frame of the incentives in order to make sort of the appropriate adjustments from short to long term. So we went through our protocol, right? As it turns out, basically, it was determined the short-term focus was going to be on strategic and cultural imperatives. Again, I'm going to underline that the cultural imperatives are big, because as you go through a change like this, you can't lose the sort of incentive or the morale of the employee and executive group, and then you have problem on top of problem at that point. So the weighting in the short-term incentive became product development. We actually, which typically is not necessarily no-no, but it's an overweight for sure. We increased the MBO piece of the bonus from 10 to about 25%. That gives a little more leeway for the committee to recognize and the CEO to recommend recognition of sort of the effort that's going on, even though it's not maybe translating to TSR or to the stock price, right? So essentially, we completely readjusted the short-term incentive. We rebalanced it. Now, given the likely need for cash in the short term, what we also did, and frankly, I typically don't like to do this, But looking at the morale and looking at the cash needs, we actually ended up paying shares and bonuses. Other way around there.
Bonuses and shares.
Thank you for paying attention, Jim.
Bonuses
Thank you for paying attention. We ended up paying bonuses and shares. Again, there was a likely uptick in the stock at the end of this whole thing, and we needed the cash. So while I typically don't like to do that, I don't recommend that because it's hard to get out of in a rising stock price. It can sometimes be the right thing to do. Okay. In terms of the long-term incentives, all the imperatives have an impact on these decisions. The decision on long-term incentives were tough given the external sort of influences that were coming to bear on the company at the time, and in these situations, almost always these external influences come to bear. But we got rid of performance-based stock. We eliminated it because there was no real confidence in the forecast about where the business model change would sort of be complete. It could be 6 months, could be a year, unlikely 6 months, but it could be 3 years. In the short term in particular, while the new strategy or while the new product sort of came into focus, it was almost impossible to tell when it was going to happen. So instead, stock options were reintroduced as the majority instrument, and then time-based restricted stock was kept in there as sort of a morale booster, a retention through this, maybe it's 2-year time frame, 3-year time frame, as we readjusted the business.
I like that. Stock options are not dead.
Stock options are not dead, and it's most people's view, including mine, that they are actually a good performance-based good performance-based instrument, frankly. So at the end of that, we made a couple tough decisions. We took much of the objective performance out of it, and we injected the plans with sort of more strategic focus and sort of implied performance.
Got it. Just one point of clarification on this particular slide. You used the word MBO. Just help us explain that little acronym for us.
Basically, their management goals.
The management by objective.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Just want to make sure.
Exactly.
Got it.
All right, well, I guess we should move on to some of my case studies here.
We've got time for another one. Give us another one.
Why not? Case study number 2. This is interesting. My bread and butter when I look at my client base is small to mid-cap software firms, some mid-cap manufacturing companies. And then when I started thinking about case studies, the ones that popped up to me, they ended up being some very large companies. And what I've got here is this was a large, mature industrial manufacturer that over the years, it developed a really sophisticated performance management program, and they really embraced EVA, economic value added. And the bottom line in any company that embraces that economic value added approach to management and financial measurement is they score themselves on whether they're creating profit that's exceeding their cost of capital. And at this company, they believe that they continue to do that. It's ultimately going to be reflected in the stock price. So management's belief in this situation is that they need discipline around capital investment. They need to be efficient. And that's the path to growing firm value over the long term. Now, the problem is that while they have been performing very well for some time in terms of efficiency and return on capital, the stock has started to lag, because they just weren't growing. And all this time, say past 3 years or so, they've been paying out excellent bonuses because they have been doing well on their core operating metrics. The profits have been fine, return on capital has been fine, but they've reached a point where the executive team was not perceiving a heck of a lot of value in equity grants because the price hasn't been moving. And meanwhile, the board was populated by some very, I call them high-profile business leaders. They were from large, well-known companies. They were very cognizant of shareholder optics and the opinions of proxy advisors. I was talking with Theo earlier. I mean, that is not a recipe for risk-taking in the executive compensation program.
No, it's not. Safety first.
Yeah, safety first when people actually know your name on the board.
Right. Yeah, that came up to me the other day. Somebody who was leaving the board was excited because it would increase their ISS score. And
they're getting away from the board.
People are cognizant of how they're viewed on boards.
Well, let me move on to what I'm calling the conclusion, but it's really the description of how the incentive program over the last year has evolved. And it really was a case of just subtle evolution and not revolution. So next slide. First of all, we didn't want to lose focus on EVA principles, but we did need to look for opportunities to better incent and reward top-line growth. And one way to do this was by adding an element to the annual bonus program that would reward revenue that was coming from new sources. So it could be new markets, it could be new products. The concept was we can't just sell what we were selling last year to the people we were selling it to last year. What can we do to sort of carve out that new revenue and reward that accordingly? Now, in its long-term incentive plan, the LTIP, the company has been obsessed with relative performance measures. They focus on relative total shareholder return. They focus on relative revenue growth, and that's relative to industry-relevant peers. And the company has been beating those peers, and executives were earning additional shares, but the board was feeling that they could have some additional leverage in the plan to further incent growth. Basically, the idea here was that relative performance was already being rewarded, but the company didn't just want to pay for being the best of the worst in down cycles, and the executives weren't all that excited about, say, getting 10% more shares in a year where the share price continued to be flat. And so this was another case where stock options aren't dead. The judicious use of stock options, and in this case it was accounting for about a third of the LTI opportunity, introduce that to provide additional leverage. And the concept was, I will say, there was some pushback from the board here because they recognized that ISS or Glass Lewis is not particularly enamored with stock options as an equity vehicle. But I think we were able to pitch this by pointing out it was a company with very strong ownership guidelines. And if you have that combination of regular grants of stock options and strong ownership guidelines, man, that can really foster a long-term alignment with shareholder returns. You got one without the other, it could be a problem. Those options are going to have a much longer performance horizon than the 3-year vesting schedule you're going to see from most performance shares.
So this is interesting to me, though. So if you look at, we went through the same imperatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same set of imperatives, different outcomes, obviously. I ended up going with case 1 completely off the rails, right? Mm-hmm. Took it away from Age of Alignment 1 and Age of Alignment 2, where you're doing a lot of financial analysis. You did the same thing, but you ended up going back to the financial analysis, just adjusting your financial metrics to be a little more focused.
You got it.
Even though we went through the exact same process. So I think it's helpful.
With the amount, we don't have a huge amount of time left,
right.
But maybe we can squeeze in one more just to sort of see where we are in the balance and make sure
let's do that. Let's move on to the next one. Next slide. And what we had here is a mature Fortune 500 distributor. It has a very fragmented customer base, a lot of product, geographic diversification. And these guys were subscribing to the concept that an enduring standard of growth was something that they were going to measure themselves against, regardless of broader economic cycles. So it's different from our last case study, where the current cycles were considered in goal setting. These guys, they were shooting for double-digit growth. And over the years, they got really good at integrating new acquisitions. They know they're good at this. They see diversification as a good thing in their line of business. So the strategy, grow via acquisition and expansion into new geographies. What else? Financial imperatives included increasing dividends, turning an underperforming stock price around. In other words, they're really trying to get the market to have faith that they're going to be able to continue that past operating performance success. So they're not the only distributor who has figured out that economies of scale are nice. So it's an industry that has a lot of consolidation. And also, they've got a very strong, unique culture. Their leadership team has been grown from within. They're long tenured. They play well together. Let's just go on to the next slide.
What'd you do for these folks?
Yeah, so the board here, they felt it was important that management continue to be held accountable for that enduring standard of 10% earnings growth. So what they came up with was a very simple PSU program, a performance share unit, that had EPS growth as the sole measure of performance. But at the same time, they felt management continuity was offering them a competitive advantage. They did not want all of their long-term incentives to be at risk. They really wanted their long-term incentive plan to really have some retention hooks. So they do have some service-vested, time-vested RSUs accounting for about a third of the LTI offering. And there's nothing all that unique about that LTI profile, but the bonus program, it does have a bit more customization. Each executive has a very distinct scope of responsibility and accountability for their own P&L, but these guys really feel it's important to emphasize that concept of team, especially since when the company wins, it's because it's able to leverage its size for cost efficiencies. So each executive, they ended up having a bit more than half their bonus opportunity tied to straightforward measures of corporate performance. And that's going to differ a little from a lot of other large companies where the lion's share goes to business unit performance. They still have roughly 1/4 tied to business unit performance, another 1/4 holding executives accountable for things like, well, strategic items, hitting integration milestones, opening new markets. Now, interestingly, this board has indicated it might shift towards weighting strategic items in the bonus program to the extent the company begins to falter relative to that long-term 10% growth goal. And the idea there is if long-term performance is suffering, it's a signal that management is slipping on operational excellence. And the right lever to pull to address that kind of problem would not be attainment of those annual budgets of operating income, revenue growth, but actually improving processes. That's kind of more strategic. I think that's a healthy attitude, but it's not easy to implement unless the management team truly does have a long-term perspective on compensation.
Actually, Jim, a quick question on that. If you think about this last case in particular, how many strategic imperatives were there that were really going? Should I identify a number?
You know what? What's interesting here is you've got you can measure this in terms of the dozens if you actually focus on everything that's happening in the business unit, but not all of those should be compensable because as soon as you start talking about what's compensable, you need focus. So these guys, if you look at their proxy disclosure, they're going to hit 3 or 4 significant strategic items per executive.
Good.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we have less than 10 minutes left. We have a bunch of questions. So some of them are actually for Deb in terms of the disclosure requirements. Deb, I'm going to plant them with you now. We'll give you a moment to think about at least one. One of them is the disclosure requirements that the SEC is proffering. Talk to us just a little bit about what it's going to look like for the U.S. legal entities of U.S. legal entities of foreign companies. How's that going to work for them? They're not used to this.
Okay, well, first, there's exemption for a foreign private issuer. So if you qualify for that exemption, you don't include that disclosure. I suppose for the other entities, you would be taking the same methodology that you took when you were doing it for the summary compensation table, which is trying to look at, TSR is what TSR is, and look at the, any kind of compensation that's paid outside of the U.S. or to U.S. expats, and trying to normalize it and explain it in the context of the business and, how certain fluctuations might differ with international pay practices. So it's a tough one, but I think that there's a little bit of precedent because if they've been filing in the U.S. and they've been subject to the proxy rules, you can turn to the summary compensation table and see how it's been done there.
Gotcha. And again, all these things that we were looking at early on, what's your best guess in terms of when these things are going to kick in? You think is it for the 2016 season or is it going to be your 2017? If you were a betting person.
I had a crystal ball. I mean, here's the two sides of the story. The first is, there's a presidential election coming up, and the thinking is that the SEC wants to get this through now and get things finalized and firmed up and effective quickly. So if that happens, comments are due July 6th, and then the SEC has to render final rules. They could make the final rules effective immediately, so the earliest it could be would be 2016. But if I actually look at history and I look at what's been happening between 2010 and 2015, There was, in 2011, there were some proposed regs issued for financial institutions on executive compensation. In 2013, there were pay-for-performance proposed rules issued, and then there were hedging and pledging rules issued earlier this year, and none of them have final rules yet. So it could go either way.
Okay, we know which way you're leaning. Thanks. I also want to, much of this, or in fact, our conversation is focused to a great extent on the publicly traded entities. But these things and the evaluation process that we go through have a tremendous impact as well on privately held entities. Theo, spend a moment or two talking us through the privately held company element of this.
Yeah, and all of what we talk about, frankly, starts at the public company level for the most part, because it's driven to an extent by large investors or ISS or regulation, right? But it almost always trickles down to private companies. And I would say this, I've seen many more private companies put in professional boards. I've seen those professional boards set up compensation committees and act just like public company committees, which means the protocols we were just going through and the imperatives that we were looking at apply absolutely to private companies as much as they do, if not more than they do in private companies. Now, granted, you often don't have equity to grant, or it's harder to measure particular financial metrics, or to an extent you've got an investor base that's looking for dividends instead. So your hands are tied in different ways, but that doesn't make it any different. You need to analyze all that. Right. You still have to do it the exact same way, and there are ways to do incentives in private companies. I have lots of private company clients.
And in that same vein, whether they're private, whether they're public, a question maybe for you, Jim, to get us thinking about this: how often do boards really evaluate or even reevaluate the strategy? Is it that you see? Is it in any given year? How much detail do they share when they do it? What's your time frame that you see most evaluations taking place? I know it depends.
It depends on if the business is going well or not.
We have 4 minutes left, so you can't spend huge amounts of time on it.
I got software clients where I think it's happening quarterly.
Okay. Yep.
Well, I think it's, as a board, you want to have at least one meeting a year where that's just the key focus. The key focus, right?
Yeah, and to me, frankly, obviously we're in this industry, so to me, the key is translating that strategic, which I believe is probably annually, that strategic focus into the compensation, and not discounting how that translates into the compensation committee room.
Right, and I would suspect that from what you've described here, in terms of the evaluation strategy, you started to give us some insight into that when you mentioned software companies. There's this perspective question. How long, when people talk about short, medium, and long term, what are you seeing in terms of integers here?
It's going to depend again. So we know that we've got some companies in the energy sector, for example, making huge capital investments. They might, have a 20-year period before that pays off. In that case, long-term can be a decade or more. Right. You've got software companies where, again, you've got to you can't see what the future looks like in 2 years. Now the shorthand, if in compensation, has usually been 1 year is short term, 3 years is medium term, anything longer than that is long term. Right. And in fact, a lot of companies will call their 3-year performance share plan a long term plan. But again, you got to customize this to your business story and when your capital investments are likely to pay off.
Okay. And the same way we've drawn this analogy to say, look, there are the similar factors that one weighs both in publicly traded companies and privately held. To a degree, these are also occurring in the not-for-profit sector as well. And I think that's an important consideration to consider.
Yeah, interestingly, in the not-for-profit sector, frankly, the imperatives that we examine and weight even more tend to be the external factors, the media, the regulation, something along those lines.
Understood. Absolutely. I know we have about a minute left. We've barely touched on the fact that there was some news on the ISS activist side that surprised us with the DuPont results, and that I think adds the broader question of where ISS and activists are in terms of this. We're probably going to have to wait on that one. Let me also just mention quickly that the availability of the slides on the additional resources section of the console, the right side of the console, there's an additional resources section. We'll be able to try to get you some more detail. I want to turn this over now to Ronell. Say thanks very much on behalf of the folks at Perlmeyer & Partners.